Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The point man steadied himself against the doorframe, his breath shallow beneath the weight of his gear. Outside, the air was thick with dust and thunder, the ground trembling from distant artillery. A tap on his shoulder meant one thing. It was time. He raised his shotgun, the metal cold even through his gloves. Inside the house, an insurgent waited, crouched in the dark beside a cracked photograph and a live grenade. Both men whispered a prayer neither would finish. The door exploded inward. Smoke filled the corridor, swallowing sound and shape. For a heartbeat, it was impossible to tell who survived. Then came the gunfire, short, brutal, final. When the echo faded, the house returned to silence, a silence that would soon stretch across the entire city. It was November 2004, and the Second Battle of Fallujah had begun. Fallujah was more than a dot on a map. It was a city caught between belief and survival. Twice in living memory, foreign armies had come. Twice, its people had watched their homes turned into battlegrounds. Now, the Americans were back. Not against Saddam's army, but against something harder to see, harder to kill. The men they would face didn't wear uniforms. They carried conviction and desperation in equal measure. And this time, they would not retreat. To the Marines, Fallujah was a mission, a name on an operations plan. To the insurgents, it was a symbol, a place to prove that the occupier could bleed. For the civilians trapped between, it was a graveyard waiting to be filled. As night fell, the first shells screamed across the Euphrates. Concrete cracked, windows shattered. The war had come not as a front line, but as a tide, and it would wash through every street before dawn. Before the assault began, Fallujah already felt hollow, like a lung emptied of air. The city's once bustling markets were silent, the call to prayer drowned beneath the distant growl of engines. In April, the Americans had tried to take Fallujah after the mutilation of 4 contractors. That operation ended in withdrawal, and in its absence, insurgents flowed back in like water finding cracks. The truce had bought time, not peace. By late 2004, the city had become a fortress. Streets were barricaded with burnt-out cars. Trenches crisscrossed courtyards, and concrete walls hid firing holes just wide enough for a rifle barrel. Mosques doubled as armories, and houses were strung together by holes punched through walls so fighters could vanish between them. Every block was a trap, every alley a potential grave. Even the air seemed to hum with anticipation. The insurgents came from everywhere. Former Baathists, tribal fighters, foreign jihadists drawn by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's call to holy war. Their numbers swelled into the thousands. Some prayed before loading their rifles. Others filmed propaganda messages beside the city's mosques. For them, Fallujah wasn't a battlefield. It was a prophecy waiting to be written in fire. They believed that defeating the Americans here would echo through the Muslim world. Outside the city, U.S. forces tightened the noose. Checkpoints closed the roads, and surveillance drones traced slow, endless circles in the sky. AC-130 gunships prowled at night, turning any vehicle with headlights into flame. Families fled through the desert, clutching children and bags of bread. By November, over 200,000 civilians had left. Those who stayed behind did so because they had nowhere else to go, or because they intended to die where they stood. By the time Operation Phantom Fury was named, Fallujah was no longer a city of the living. Its population had been replaced by fighters and fear. Clotheslines hung empty, the windows black. Beneath them, in cellars lit by candlelight, men whispered verses over ammunition boxes. The Americans waited just beyond the horizon, and in that tense stillness, both sides prepared for the storm that neither would survive unchanged. As the sun rose on November 7, 2004, Fallujah was already surrounded. More than 10,000 U.S. Marines and soldiers crouched in the dust north of the city, engines idling, waiting for the signal to strike. Behind them were armored columns and supply convoys stacked with food, ammunition, and fuel. Above them, the hum of drones and gunships never stopped. It was the calm before the rupture, a silence so thick it felt physical. Major General Richard Natonsky, commander of the Marine Expeditionary Force, had divided the assault into 2 great thrusts. Regimental Combat Team 1 would attack from the north, while RCT-7 would strike from the northeast. Their goal? Cut the city in half, then grind it down block by block. The British Black Watch Battalion guarded the flanks, keeping reinforcements from slipping in or survivors from slipping out. It was a plan built for efficiency, but Fallujah was not a place that rewarded order. The insurgents had prepared their defenses for months. Sniper nests dotted rooftops, IEDs were buried under pavement, and houses were wired with explosives. They had turned the city into a machine designed to bleed whoever entered it. Still, the Americans had the advantage of scale and technology. Tanks lined up along the northern railway berm, engines rumbling like thunder. Mortars fired illumination rounds, bathing the city in ghostly white. Then the air changed. The assault began. AC-130s unleashed their cannons first, striking safe houses and communication posts. Drones guided artillery into suspected command centers. The first ground movement came hours later, engineers blowing gaps in the railway berm while riflemen dashed across. The Marines captured the train station, then the neighborhoods beyond. Progress was measured not in miles, but in doorways and intersections. For every building taken, another had to be cleared behind it. Inside the city, insurgents moved like smoke. Four-man teams slipping through holes in walls, firing RPGs, and disappearing before counterfire arrived. They knew the terrain too well. Some mosques served as command points, their loudspeakers blaring verses meant to rally fighters and unnerve invaders. But the Americans pressed on, every street a test of endurance. One Marine radioed back after 2 days of fighting, "We own it on the map, but not in the dirt." And he was right. Fallujah wasn't conquered yet. It was just beginning to wake up. By the second night, Fallujah had swallowed them whole. What looked like streets on the map were now trenches of debris and flame. The air was thick with dust so fine it coated lungs and eyes, turning every breath into grit. Tanks crawled forward, firing at shadows, while squads moved through alleys that ended in walls of collapsed concrete. Radios crackled constantly, but voices blurred under the roar of gunfire. The city had become a living maze, and every turn might be the last. The Marines advanced by instinct, one house at a time. Engineers blew holes through adjoining walls so squads could move without stepping onto mined streets. Snipers watched from rooftops, tracing flashes of movement between windows. Each building was its own battlefield, each doorway a gamble. They used hand signals more than words, communicating through nods, gestures, and the simple trust that no one wanted to die alone. The insurgents fought in small cells, agile and invisible. They fired from basements, vanished into tunnels, then reappeared behind American lines. Some carried walkie-talkies, directing mortar fire from rooftops. Others hid inside mosques, knowing their enemies hesitated to fire on holy ground. Their strategy was simple: make the Marines fight the same ground twice, then a third time. Progress was measured in inches, not blocks. Every step forward left someone behind. At night, the city pulsed with light, tracer rounds, explosions, fires spreading across rooftops. The sound never stopped. Automatic fire echoing through narrow alleys, tank shells slamming into walls, the sharp crack of snipers that came from nowhere and everywhere. The Marines learned to sleep sitting up, rifles resting across their knees, boots still laced. They were no longer fighting to capture Fallujah. They were fighting to survive it. In the north, the Jolan district burned brightest. Once a quiet residential area, it was now the stronghold of the most hardened fighters. Barricades of sandbags and twisted cars sealed every street. The Americans shelled it relentlessly, but each blast only carved new positions for the defenders. By dawn, the ground trembled under constant fire. "It's not a city," one Marine muttered. "It's a fortress made of ghosts." The deeper they pushed, the clearer it became. Fallujah wasn't built for defense. It had been redesigned for death. Every door, every alley, every window carried the same threat. Wires hung like cobwebs from ceilings, leading to explosives hidden in radios, buckets, even corpses. A kicked can might detonate a street. A child's toy could end a squad. The insurgents had turned the city into a single, interconnected weapon. The Marines adapted fast. They no longer entered doors, they blew through walls. They stopped trusting floors, stairs, and silence. Each house cleared was marked with paint and smoke, only for insurgents to reoccupy it hours later. The battle was endless repetition: breach, fire, clear, move. Some houses were empty, others filled with resistance that erupted the moment boots touched tile. One Marine called it fighting a memory that never stayed dead. The IEDs were the most feared. Buried under roads, hidden in trash, or strapped to bodies, They waited patiently. Convoys advanced in single file, scanning for the impossible. Engineers with metal detectors swept every path, their hands trembling above the dust. When the explosions came, they were deafening, tearing through air and armor alike. The Marines called it the Fallujah lottery. No one knew whose number would be called next. By mid-November, the Marines had learned to answer fear with aggression. When a sniper fired, they flattened the building. When a street looked suspicious, they shelled it until it didn't exist. The mission had become survival through dominance. Civilians still trapped inside waved white flags from shattered windows, their cries lost in the smoke. War had erased the boundaries between soldier and bystander, between hunter and hunted. As days turned to weeks, the city became a wasteland of broken geometry. Walls tilted like teeth, cars fused into the road, smoke hanging where sky should be. Each explosion felt smaller only because there were too many to count. Fallujah no longer resembled a city at all. It was an anatomy of war, stripped to its bones. And inside those ruins, both sides bled until they could no longer tell which one had started it. By the third week, the fighting had narrowed to its cruelest form, house to house, room to room, breath to breath. There were no front lines now, only walls separating the living from the dead. Every home was a potential ambush. Marines kicked down doors, threw grenades, and cleared corners in darkness thick with dust. The rhythm was mechanical: burst, fire, silence, repeat. But behind that rhythm was exhaustion, deeper than fear. Inside, the rooms told their own stories. Some held nothing but overturned furniture and the smell of oil. Others were charred tombs filled with shattered glass and blood. A few still had families huddled in corners, their eyes hollow, their voices gone. The Marines hesitated, then moved on. Survival had no room for hesitation. One officer said later, "We stopped counting how many houses we cleared. It didn't matter. They were all the same." When the resistance grew too heavy, the Marines used fire instead of footsteps. Mortars and white phosphorus shells rained down on the densest blocks, chemical fire that crawled along the ground, lighting the air itself. Commanders called it necessary. Journalists called it something else. The city didn't care what anyone called it. It only burned. By morning, the smoke rolled low over the rooftops, blurring the line between day and night. Sleep came in fragments. Men curled in corners, rifles on their chests, using their helmets as pillows. Some talked softly about home, others stared into nothing. Mortar fire woke them every few hours, shaking walls already broken. They ate cold rations with soot-covered hands, drinking from canteens that tasted of metal. In the still moments, they could hear whispers, insurgents shifting nearby, the cries of wounded civilians, prayers murmured in two languages to the same God. By November 13th, the Marines had claimed most of northern Fallujah, yet no one felt victory. The further they advanced, the stronger the resistance grew. Each street fought like it wanted to be remembered. Each block demanded blood before it was given up. Commanders spoke of objectives met, but the men only saw another endless row of doors waiting to be breached. Fallujah wasn't falling, it was consuming. By mid-November, the Marines had reached the city's center, where Fallujah's heart beat slow and angry beneath the smoke. Streets that once carried traffic now formed a ring of ruins around the Jolan district, the last and fiercest stronghold. The closer they came, the more the air thickened with cordite and rot. The insurgents had dug in, every building reinforced, every window a firing slit. They were fighting not to win, but to make the Americans choke on every inch of ground. Controlling key landmarks became the new obsession. Bridges, hospitals, and mosques were more than tactical objectives. They were symbols. Whoever held them controlled the story. Iraqi commandos, guided by U.S. advisors, stormed Fallujah General Hospital at dawn, capturing it in minutes. The insurgents had tried to destroy their own wounded before retreating, but the hospital stood, blackened and half-empty. To the Marines, it was progress. To everyone else, it was a grave with electricity. South of the river, AC-130 gunships traced burning arcs across the sky. Tanks fired through walls instead of around them. Snipers hunted from the rooftops while engineers detonated new paths through apartment blocks. The city no longer resembled its own layout. Every landmark was gone, every street renamed by combat. Maps became useless, squads navigated by memory, by smell, by instinct. Progress was measured by survival, not coordinates. Inside the Jolan district, resistance turned suicidal. Fighters emerged from tunnels beneath collapsed buildings, fired, then vanished again. Mortars fell so close that men shouted just to know they were still alive. It was like wrestling the city itself, one sergeant said later. You didn't fight people, you fought the buildings. The Marines answered with overwhelming firepower, leveling anything that moved. By the end of the week, Jolan was a crater more than a neighborhood. When night came, the fighting continued under red tracer light. The city glowed faintly, not from electricity, but from flame. Command radioed back that the operation was on schedule, that momentum was holding. But in the eyes of the men moving through those ruins, nothing felt like momentum. It felt like gravity, pulling them deeper into something they couldn't climb out of. Fallujah's heart hadn't stopped. It was still beating, beneath rubble, beneath ash, beneath the weight of both armies. By the third week, the Marines held what maps called Central Fallujah, but the maps lied. The city wasn't conquered, it was carved apart. Each block taken had cost blood. Each street a handful of names added to lists that no one wanted to read. The field hospitals overflowed. Medics worked knee-deep in bandages and dust, patching wounds they couldn't always close. Every scream blended into the low, constant rumble of artillery. Progress had a sound, and it was suffering. Command reports called it success. They spoke of momentum, of zones cleared, of victory close at hand. But the men on the ground no longer listened. Success meant another street gone, another comrade zipped into a bag, another civilian buried in the rubble. We were winning, one corporal said, but winning didn't look like anything I wanted to see. The official updates rolled in, clean and detached, while the city burned a little hotter each night. Rules blurred as exhaustion deepened. The Marines stopped hesitating. If a house looked suspicious, it came down. If a sniper fired, the entire block disappeared under shells. Civilians waving white flags emerged from basements, coughing, crying, clutching nothing. Some were let out. Some never made it. The Americans did what they had to do, and the insurgents made sure that doing so would haunt them forever. Fallujah was not just fighting back. It was taking pieces of everyone who entered. Yet, amid the ruins, small mercies still flickered. A Marine shared water with an old man. A medic carried a wounded Iraqi child through gunfire. These moments didn't undo the horror, but they proved it hadn't devoured everyone completely. Compassion survived, not because the war allowed it, but because the soul demanded it. Even in hell, humanity refused to disappear. By the end of November, the city was half silent, half screaming. Fires burned where mosques once stood. Tanks rumbled through streets now unrecognizable, their treads grinding over what had once been home. Fallujah was dying, but not yet dead. Its last breath would be the hardest to take. And for those still inside, that breath was coming soon. In early December, the fight narrowed to pockets of resistance. Small, stubborn clusters of fighters who refused to surrender. But one building would become legend among those who survived. A two-story house on the western edge of the city, later known only as the House of Hell. It began like any other operation. A squad approached quietly, their boots crunching glass, rifles ready. The door hung slightly open. Inside, everything looked ordinary, until the first Marine stepped through. Gunfire erupted from above and below. The house came alive with bullets. Marines fell instantly, their comrades diving for cover as grenades rolled down the stairs. Reinforcements rushed in, but every entry point was a death trap. The fighters inside were relentless, foreign veterans from Chechnya, trained in street warfare, moving with precision and fury. They fought floor by floor, room by room, as if the house itself demanded their sacrifice. The battle raged for hours. Tanks fired point blank at the walls, blasting holes large enough to see through, yet the gunfire from within didn't stop. Smoke poured from the windows, black and heavy. Marines stormed the entrance again and again, clearing one corner only to be driven back by fire from the next. It was chaos compressed into four walls, heat, blood, dust, and screams blending into one endless roar. By nightfall, the order came to end it. Engineers surrounded the house with explosives, while snipers watched the upper floors for any last flicker of movement. The blast came without warning, a thunderclap that folded the house inward, the shockwave rolling down the street like an aftershock of rage. When the dust settled, the structure was gone, replaced by a pit of burning debris. Dozens lay dead inside, insurgents and Marines alike, indistinguishable in the rubble. The survivors called it the House of Hell, not for its brutality, but for what it revealed. Fallujah was not just a place of war, it was a place that consumed men whole, leaving only the echo of their struggle behind. After that day, every doorway felt heavier, every silence sharper. One Marine wrote later, "We stopped knocking after that. We just went in. You can't knock on hell's door twice." By mid-December, Fallujah was barely breathing. The northern districts were rubble, the center burned hollow, and the southern edge, what remained of the Jolan, was a graveyard of smoke and steel. The Marines called it mopping up, but there was nothing clean about it. Small groups of insurgents still fought from basements and alleys, slipping between shattered homes like ghosts. They fired, vanished, and reappeared blocks away, refusing to die quietly. The city no longer belonged to either side, it belonged to the fight itself. Every house had to be cleared again, even those marked secure days earlier. Marines moved cautiously through rooms that all looked the same, charred walls, bullet holes, silence too heavy to trust. Some doors opened to empty air, others to ambush. The men had stopped thinking of victory. They thought only of finishing. "We were ghosts chasing ghosts," one private wrote later. The only difference was who disappeared first. By now, the streets were so cratered that tanks could barely move. Convoys crawled through the ruins, their treads grinding over twisted rebar and corpses buried in dust. Artillery still fell day and night, and the city pulsed with its own terrible rhythm: detonation, echo, silence, detonation again. Drones circled above, watching from a sky as gray as the ground below. From that height, Fallujah looked conquered. From the ground, it looked endless. Civilians began to emerge from the ruins, thin and silent, waving white flags made from torn sheets. They were covered in ash, their eyes hollow, their voices soft as wind. Marines gave them water, searched them, then sent them towards safe zones. Some carried children, others carried photographs of those already gone. For the first time, the soldiers saw the people behind the city's ruins, and for a moment, even victory felt cruel. By December 13th, commanders announced the city was secure. The battle was over. But as night fell, sporadic gunfire still echoed in the alleys, and somewhere beyond the smoke, another explosion rolled through the dust. The radio said, "Mission accomplished." The men on the ground said nothing. Fallujah was quiet now, but it wasn't peace. It was the sound a city makes when it stops fighting and starts dying. When the last shots faded, Fallujah felt hollow, like a lung that had forgotten how to breathe. The streets were lined with broken cars, the air thick with the smell of metal and smoke. Marines moved through the ruins in silence, their boots crunching on glass and bone. Every wall was scarred, every building wounded. Dogs picked through the rubble, barking at ghosts. The battle was over, but the city still trembled as if unsure it was allowed to rest. Command called it victory. Reports listed neighborhoods secured, objectives achieved. But to those walking through the aftermath, there was no triumph, only a weight that pressed down from every direction. The mosques were open to the sky, the schools reduced to gravel, the homes too shattered to rebuild. One Marine wrote home, "We didn't take a city, we unmade one." His words were truer than he knew. Iraqi soldiers and engineers followed behind, clearing the debris and collecting bodies. Civilians began to return, carrying what little they had left: blankets, pots, a few family photos. Some found their houses gone, others found the dead still inside. They didn't cry. They just stood there, as if grief itself had already burned away. Reporters came later, filming what remained: a gray, silent wasteland. The footage reached the world, and the world looked away. At night, the Marines gathered on rooftops, watching the city smolder under a pale moon. Fires flickered like distant stars. Some men talked softly, voices barely above the wind. Others said nothing for hours. No one dared to call it peace. They knew peace was something earned, not declared. Fallujah was quiet, yes, but it was the kind of quiet that follows screaming, not the kind that brings rest. When the order came to withdraw, they packed in silence. Convoys rolled past the ruins they had created, engines humming through the dust. Behind them, Fallujah lay still, half dead, half enduring, waiting to decide what it would become. For the men who left, the battle was over. For the city, it was only beginning. Fallujah never really ended. The battle was over, but its echo clung to everything: the soil, the air, the people who returned to rebuild among the ashes. Families dug through rubble for keepsakes, for bones, for proof that something had survived. The city's skyline rose again, but unevenly, like scar tissue forming over a wound that refused to close. The call to prayer returned, but it sounded thinner now, its echo passing through empty streets that remembered too much. Doctors in the reopened hospital began to notice strange patterns. Babies born with missing limbs, illnesses no one could name, bodies scarred from exposure to weapons that left no visible mark. They whispered about depleted uranium, about phosphorus, about the poisons buried in the dust. The war had moved on, but it had left its fingerprints in every cell of the city. Fallujah was still burning, just slower, quieter, inside its people. For those who stayed, survival became routine. They patched holes in the walls, swept the same dust from the same floors, and planted flowers over collapsed courtyards. Children grew up playing among wreckage they couldn't identify, chasing soccer balls past bullet holes their parents refused to explain. Everyone knew where the dead had fallen, but no one talked about it. The silence became its own form of mourning, a language older than grief. The Americans withdrew, leaving the city in the hands of Iraqi forces. Officially, Fallujah was free. In truth, it was exhausted. It had survived one occupation only to face another, this time by its own divisions. Sectarian lines, political betrayals, the old wounds reopened. What had been destroyed by bombs was now slowly unraveled by memory. The city no longer trusted anyone, not even itself. And yet, life persisted. Markets reopened, schools filled again, and the smell of baking bread drifted once more through the alleys. But every sound carried an undertone of remembrance: the clatter of pots, the rustle of curtains, the hum of generators blending with the faint, almost inaudible rhythm of loss. Fallujah was alive, but never unscarred. Its heart still beat, but the sound it made was not of triumph. It was survival, steady and unrelenting. By the late 2000s, Fallujah was alive again, though never whole. Cranes dotted the horizon, rebuilding what bombs had torn down. Children played soccer in streets once filled with gunfire. Vendors sold tea beside walls still marked with shrapnel. On the surface, life had returned. But beneath it all, something older pulsed, a memory the city could not bury. Every sunrise glowed over ruins that had only changed shape, not meaning. People rebuilt because they had to, not because they believed it would last. The power flickered, water ran brown, and the hospitals overflowed with sicknesses no one spoke about. Yet each day, shopkeepers swept the dust from their doorsteps and opened anyway. Women hung laundry on wires stretched across crumbled balconies. Children laughed where mortars once fell. Fallujah's endurance wasn't hope. It was defiance, a refusal to vanish no matter how many times it was erased. But even as the buildings rose, the old fire simmered beneath the ground. By 2014, black flags returned to the rooftops. The world called it ISIS, but to the people of Fallujah, it was the same nightmare wearing a different face. Fighters moved through the streets like smoke, declaring the city theirs once again. For those who had survived the Americans, this new rule felt like history repeating in sharper cruelty. They whispered, "The war never left. It just changed uniforms." When ISIS was finally driven out 2 years later, Fallujah was liberated for the third time in a generation. But the word liberation had lost its taste. The city was tired of being saved, tired of being destroyed for the sake of others' salvation. People returned once more to rebuild the ruins they had already rebuilt twice before. And through it all, Fallujah kept breathing. Not loudly, not proudly, just stubbornly. A city that refused to die, even when no one believed it should still be alive. For the Marines who fought there, Fallujah never stayed behind. It followed them home, in dreams, in echoes, in the smell of diesel on quiet streets. They had fought one of the fiercest urban battles since Hue City, but history books couldn't capture what it did to them. Some came back whole in body, but hollow in spirit. Others carried shrapnel under their skin, reminders that throbbed with every change of weather. For many, the war didn't end, it simply changed shape. At reunions, they spoke little about tactics or victory. Instead, they remembered faces: the buddy who went through the wrong doorway, the corpsman who stayed too long under fire, the sergeant who cracked a joke minutes before dying. They remembered the sound of radios filled with static, the metallic tang of blood and cordite, the silence after an explosion. These memories didn't fade with time. They fermented, growing heavier, sharper, harder to explain. Some went back to Fallujah years later, contractors, aid workers, or men chasing ghosts. They found a city rebuilt, its scars hidden under paint and plaster. Children laughed in the same streets where they had once fought, and the smell of bread replaced the stench of gunpowder. One Marine stood by the river and whispered, "It's beautiful now. It shouldn't be, but it is." For him, that beauty was harder to face than the battle had ever been. Others never returned. They avoided the news, skipped war documentaries, and stayed quiet whenever the name was mentioned. For them, Fallujah was not a place but a weight, something carried behind the ribs, pressing against the heart. They lived ordinary lives, raised families, worked jobs, but part of them never left those narrow streets. The war had taken not just their comrades, but their ability to forget. Even now, when they close their eyes, they still see the same light, the flicker of fire against concrete, the glow of tracer rounds cutting the dark. They still hear the same sound, the hum of helicopters, the short breath before a door explodes. And in those moments, they understand what the city already knows. War doesn't end when it's over. It only goes quiet for a while. Fallujah stands today beneath the same desert sun, alive but altered, its skyline smoother, its rhythm slower, its memory unchanged. The people go about their days, children running past rebuilt mosques, old men drinking tea beside the river, merchants shouting prices over the hum of generators. Yet beneath the sound of life lies something quieter, a hum, a residue, the soft vibration of a city that refuses to forget. Fallujah no longer burns, but it still remembers the heat. To the outside world, it's a story finished long ago, a line in a history book, a footnote to a larger war. But to those who fought, those who fled, and those who stayed, it never truly ended. The veterans still dream of it, the civilians still breathe it, and the soil still holds the ghosts of both. The war has ended in every language except memory. In that language, it still speaks. Some call it survival, others call it endurance. But to the people who know, Fallujah's true legacy is neither. It is understanding of what humans can destroy and what they insist on rebuilding anyway. The city is proof that destruction can erase buildings but not belonging, that faith can outlast fear, and that silence can carry more truth than speeches ever will. Fallujah has become both lesson and warning. At sunset, when the Euphrates turns gold, the city glows the same way it did on the first day of the assault. Only now, the fire is gone, and the light is softer, less rage, more remembrance. Somewhere, a call to prayer rises and echoes across the river, mingling with the sound of children laughing. It is a fragile harmony, made not of peace but of persistence. The battle is over, but the echo remains, and it will, for as long as there are those who remember.